Hello again. I hope you have joined. I hope you have enjoyed the coffee break, and I've met some of you in the lounge. It was really great to see some of you, at least the face, and to be able to say hello, even if we cannot be physically present. So I hope this conference comes close to a physical experience, even if it's not. And we will continue now with some presentations related more to the soil. First one on nutrient use and some results of new recycled nutrient products. And then we will follow also with a presentation on the use of peat and plastic mulch. But so first the nutrients. And the first presentation comes from Jakob Magid. He's a researcher at the Copenhagen University and is a member of the RELAX consortium. So please, Jakob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bram. I look forward to giving this presentation. Let me just see if I can share my screen and get it on. So do you see a presentation screen now?
Yes, all is fine.
Okay, thank you. So let me walk you through today's program. The key headlines of this talk is lessons learned from farm gate studies and contaminants in recycled fertilizers and how problematic they are. And finally, on recently agreed positions on recycling of nutrients in the RELAX project. The first thing we did was to make a study of farms in different countries and regions, indeed, in Europe, where we had interviews from each farm, looking at farm gate balances, covering 3 years. And I mean, mainly the feed, the seeds, the biological end fixations and other inputs and fertilizers, and then the outputs, and no more. But it's still quite a detailed study. We looked at farms that were predominantly stockless farms or farms with just a few animals, because we felt that it was here we would find the greatest challenges when it comes to nutrients. And we generated a lot of data. I will just show you a few. Here we have some farm gate budgets with nitrogen and phosphorus in the different countries and regions. And generally we find a surplus in nitrogen. We found many farms with a negative balance of P and K, but also some farms with a substantial surplus of K and P. And the farm type was the most important factor. Here, stockless farms had the highest deficits. Some of the key results was that a high reliance on biological nitrogen fixation is correlated with a low output. Because when you're stockless, I mean, there's not so much you can use that land for except to generate nitrogen for the coming crop. And P and K budgets decrease with increasing reliance on BNF because the import of nutrients obviously is much reduced. And here you can see some results. This is, you have N supplied by the legumes in percent of total N. And then you have the farm gate budget of P and K. And then there was also some measurements of soil phosphorus in Germany. And you have all German farms, there's clearly a negative relationship between the years of organic farming and the soil extractable P, or the plant available P. And it was a bit stronger, or more strongly negative, if you just looked at the farms with less than 27 years of management. Some published articles on this. I will not go into details with that. You could find them afterwards when you get the PowerPoint. Very important result has to do with the nitrogen efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency. And this is a graph where we've plotted all the farms, and each point is 3 years of balance. And you can see there's an area here where you have a lot of input and relatively low output. So that's a low use efficiency. Then there's the other area here with the darker gray, where you have a high use efficiency and a risk of mining the soil in this white sweet spot. But so the use efficiency was highly variable between countries and farms. But then also looking at the absolute output, we have many farms below 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And just to put it in a different way, 60 kilograms would be equivalent to 3 tons of grain per hectare. And this is the median value of all farms, rather much lower than 60. And the average for Switzerland, Denmark, and northern Germany is around 80 kilograms. And here you have an average for conventional arable European farms. Now, I mean, there is a very remarkable difference between the countries, and it's also expressed, for example, if you take a quick look at the type and source of external fertilizer input in Hungary and Denmark. Here you can maybe just note the distances. In Hungary, they are up to 1,000 kilometers, many times over 100 kilometers. They have to source the nutrients from very far away, whereas in Denmark, it's just more or less the neighboring farm, and in a few cases above 50 kilometers. So I mean, we're talking about a very remarkable regional disparity, and there's no way around that. So these are some of the outcomes from the studies of different farms. So obviously, it is interesting to see if we can get more nutrients into organic farming, and therefore we reviewed the current knowledge on contaminants in recycled fertilizers and how problematic they are. We had an online webinar in 5 sessions during March and April this year, about 120 participants from different sectors, and then 18 invited speakers. So I'll just give you a few takes from here. I mean, not all of it, obviously. With regard to the source, fate, and impact of heavy metals, we have zinc, copper, and cadmium that are the main metals of concern. And the net input comes from animal manure and feed supplements and phosphate fertilizers. The cadmium mass balance in Europe is close to steady state, so not of great concern, whereas zinc and copper are more concerning, and mineral feed supplements have the main responsibility for this. It's also important to mention that plant availability is actually what is important, and also for microbes, because there is a balance between antibiotic resistance and metals for microbes. With regard to the organic and emerging contaminants, we see that sludge quality, for example, has improved greatly over the past decades, and the behavior in the soil plant system gives negligible plant uptake. There are some compounds, halogenated compounds, that are a priority, and we need smarter chemicals in the future. Animal ingestion is a main pathway for transfer to the human diet, but it can be controlled with good management practices. And there are also data on milk concentrations in some of the most problematic chemicals that are given to extreme short-term exposure, and milk concentrations revert very quickly. So There is no immediate risk for health to the health for consumers, but there is a good reason to work on this for also in the future. There were discussions during these seminars, and there clearly was a vote that organic agriculture should increase both nutrient use efficiency and productivity and sustainability. The least acceptable was use of conventional pig slurry, followed by sewage sludge. There was a discussion on the acceptability of mineral nitrogen sources, as well as suitability of digestates for intensive organic production. And then there's still some questions on the risk assessment of antibiotic in soil and the resilience, although there's a lot of evidence that soils are really resilient here. So then further discussions, do approaches to recover nutrients from manures support a non-sustainable system or digestates? Does recycling of non-farm organic waste represent a real reliance on conventional nutrients, or is it a sensible use of a product, reuse of a product? Is it a breach of principles? Is it a compromise, or rather a fulfillment of the organic ideology of working within closed cycles? And then finally, nitrogen, should it be slow? Could it be fast? And how do we look at this? So we're working on a synthesis of the workshop and will submit for publication. Elsa asked me to put in a few slides on a long-term experiment that we have at our university. It's been set up with annual application of sewage sludge and compost from household waste, human urine, and a number of common fertilizers. And we have supplied high amounts in some treatments over the past 20 years, corresponding to more than 100 years of legal application of sewage sludge, compost, and cattle manure to put the system under pressure. We've begun to better understand how much the soil helps us, and we have not appreciated this enough in the past. We see multi-resistant bacteria applied with cattle manure and the others to decay very quickly, and they cannot be detected after a few weeks. And although undesirable compounds are added, especially in household waste, and to some extent sludge, it doesn't affect the content of the crops as they become fixed in the soil. The soil is being rebuilt over time, so there's this aging process. We can see that the soil and biology are positively affected by the various organic fertilizers. Organic matter content is increased, in some cases so much that plant available water increases significantly. There's a rather high long-term nitrogen and phosphorus effect from sewage sludge and less from compost. Numbers of bacteria, fungi, and the microfauna increases with the application of the organic fertilizers, also those from the urban areas. Earthworms increase, especially for some reason due to the application of sewage sludge. And the biodiversity of the organisms appear to be unaffected, but that will be more solid later on. So despite the supply of large quantities of products containing small amounts of unwanted substances, including microplastics, which is equivalent to more than 100 years of legal supply, we cannot see any harm to soil health. We had agreed on some positions on nutrients. So first, to retain a high farm productivity, stockless, arable, and low animal-intensive farmers are highly dependent on external sources of N besides biological nitrogen fixation. To ensure sufficient nutrient supply and avoid nutrient depletion in soils, we need to develop recycling of societal waste streams further, and also to look into the research on this. And concomitantly, we need to also develop organic agriculture rules alongside with this. It's necessary to focus on a balanced long-term supply of all nutrients and not just phosphorus. But in some situations, phosphorus is really the most limiting nutrient in the long term, and we don't have appropriate and legal peat fertilizers in sufficient amounts for the time being. Recycling is in line with organic principles. It's recognized that societal and food industry waste streams have improved in quality as contaminant levels have decreased, and it's necessary to widen the access to recycled waste products based on specific quality criteria. Regarding heavy metals, it's zinc and copper that are of concern, and they originate mainly from the mineral feed supplements. So most organic contaminants are bound in soil, leading to negligible plant uptake, and direct animal ingestion can be prevented by management practices. Finally, lower water solubility of many recycled peat fertilizers makes them suitable for organic agriculture. Mineral end sources needs to be further discussed in the organic sector. Obviously, there's quite a bit of work to do here. So thank you very much for your attention. I guess I should just stop and unshare my screen, Molly.
Yes, you can unshare your screen, and I will ask you one follow-up question, and I also invite all the participants on the Hubulo platform to post a question in the chat function. So thanks, Jakob, for putting so clear the need to source external nutrients and phosphorus and other nutrient sources. Also in organic agriculture, you made the point that current practices and especially biological nitrogen fixation is not always enough. And you also explained the potential of some recycled nutrient technology. So my question is, according to you, your personal opinion, which nutrient recycling technology should receive the priority, or where should the discussion be focused at first? Because there's many potential technologies to be considered, and as an organic movement, where should we pay our attention to first?
Well, I think that I mean, for intensive or more, those farms that are on the more intensive part of this, I mean, yeah, of this line, I think that anaerobic digestion is a very interesting technology. And I mean, this is currently in Denmark, where I come from. There is a lot of interest and investment going on for various reasons, but mainly driven by the need for the energy output to go towards a more climate friendly energy sector. But along with this also comes a possibility for nutrients. And I saw the results from an interview of all the, or 100, I mean, I'm not sure if we are closer to 150 today in this country, but half of them were very interested in supplying to organic farmers, and about a third of them already did, and half of their output was in the that it could be deemed appropriate for organic farming purposes. So I mean, there is a potential there, but there's obviously a need to work on both the practice but also the principles here. I think in some countries it's not obvious that this is a good way to go, but yeah, it is currently being followed in my country, and also certainly in other countries.
Okay, good. Thanks for bringing that in. I will close this subject now, but I see there are some questions coming up in the chat, so thanks a lot for that, and please continue posting questions. In the meantime, we go to Anne-Kristin Løes, even up further north in Europe, from Norway, the Norwegian Center for Organic Agriculture. She is part of the Organic Plus project, and she will bring their perspective on nutrients.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the slides?
Yes,
okay?
It's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thanks a lot for this opportunity to present our results, and I think they fit quite well into what Jakob just presented. And we have been collaborating quite a lot with the RELAX project about the nutrients and fertilization for organic agriculture. We had a common workshop at the Organic World Congress in September, and also several people from Organic Plus participated in this workshop, which Jakob was mentioning this spring, which was very interesting and very successful. So I present now the results on behalf of Work Package 5, which has the short name Soil in the Organic Plus project. So when I go to the next slide, here you see the list of all the co-authors, which are Kasper Larsen from Denmark, and Sabine Sikeli and Caroline Weiler from Honheim, and Francis, Judith, and Dennis from the Center of Water and Agroecology Research in Coventry, and then Danuta and Christina from Poland, and Alev Kir from Turkey. So you see, we have been doing a lot of field studies and greenhouse studies and pot experiments on different fertilizers, which could replace conventional manure in organic farming systems. That's a sort of headline, and we will go through this now. So from the large perspective to possible solutions, there is a very ambitious goals for organic agriculture in Europe, that we should go to 25% of organically managed area by 2030, and concurrently also a sharp decrease in the volume of animal husbandry. So and we should eat less meat. So we really need to look out for other types of fertilizers. And that also is not only for animal products, but also plant-based products, like you can see on the picture to the right of these tomatoes, that there's a serious risk to apply fertilizers based on conventional materials, because they could contain pesticides like clopyralid, which tomatoes are very sensitive to. And we should increase the integrity of organic agriculture by purchasing less inputs from conventional animal husbandry. And I mentioned this, that the animal husbandry is likely to decrease. And as you see on the bottom to the right here, that even large chemical fertilizer companies like the Norwegian Yara company are becoming really interested in recycled nutrients. So you can read more about that in their recent strategy paper. So what we did in Organic Plus in our work package, together with work package 3, and Nikos presented very nicely about the copper and sulfur earlier today, that we had a broad mapping of the input of any kind almost of contentious inputs. So we had collaborated on the mapping, so it covered both plant protection inputs and fertilizer inputs, and also the use of peat and plastic in the production of, and then we picked out some relevant crops per country which participated in this survey, and then we interviewed experts. We had made an interview guide. So they described the typical input of all inputs in a typical growing of these crops. So you see, altogether we had 60 interviews as our material, and then the conclusions were that the organic growers, they use as much plastic and peat as the conventional growers, and there is a broad use of conventional poultry manure, especially enriched with vinasse and meat and bone meal, but also a broad range of plant-based fertilizers, and it's quite variable between the countries. So what we have been doing with respect to fertilizers, and Francis will talk more about the peat and plastic in a separate presentation afterwards. But in our fertilizer task, we were characterizing relevant fertilizers and comparing them with the conventional animal manure controls. And we tried also to develop a system approach to integrate these products into organic growing. So we have had trials at different sites comparing these fertilizers with the currently applied contentious inputs, and we were emphasizing a local availability and local relevance. Kan man ikke se det?
Jo, vi ser det, men vi ser det ikke i presentasjonsmodus.
Ja, men det har jeg, sorry, this was just a little help from a friend. I'm sorry that I can't, for some reason, I'm not able to show it in a full screen mode. I hope it doesn't affect too much negatively on your attention. Okay, so our system approach, well, that's a little bit tricky because some of these fertilizer products we already heard about could maybe be categorized in more than one of these categories. But we try to present a sort of fertilizer theory here and propose a system approach that we divide the many different fertilizers we applied or tested into urban, vegan, or resid inputs. So the urban inputs or fertilizers, they would be defined as something which is closing the rural-urban cycle. And that could very well be digestate from household waste, but it could also be compost from household waste, or otherwise, or also sewage sludge coming from urban areas back to the rural areas with the nutrients and the organic matter. Then we have focused a bit on these vegan fertilizers. They can be seen as something which could improve the internal nutrient cycle on the farm by using legume or non-legume plants for fertilization. And then the last group is this resid, that is residues from non-contentious sources like organic food production. You can see an example here on the right side. These upper pictures with the 3 jars that you see the organic tofu whey applied in Hohenheim. That's an example of a resid product, but it could also be marine materials like you see on the bottom picture with this green bucket that is acidified fish bones, which we have applied here in Tingvoll. So now I will present a few highlights from each of these fertilizer groups. So starting with the Danish trial, where they applied, had a special interest in household waste, source separated organic household waste. And that is not so easy to achieve. So they had to collaborate a lot with 2 renovation companies, the Dhaka and Varga company, and make them in a pilot plant, make this pulp and digest it in the pilot plant to get the fertilizer product for the 3 field trials, which were placed on organic farms in different sites in Denmark. And you can see on the left side here, there's an impressive number of organic farms in Denmark spread all over the country. So in this main trial, the digestate was compared with pig slurry, and then 2 types of digestate with approximately the same dry matter content, with a little bit different nitrogen content, but they were aiming at applying 90 kilo of nitrogen, or ammonia nitrogen per hectare. And the yields you can see with highlighted with the green color. Without any fertilizer, you got 4 tons of barley per hectare, and then with the fertilized, that yield increased to 5.6 tons per hectare. So you can just conclude that household waste digestate functions just as good as pig slurry as a fertilizer for barley. And then they had a more advanced study with more steps of nitrogen. And then they compared also with some other products like this Ögro meat and bone meal fertilizer, and also cattle slurry mixed up with some household waste, which is much more easy to get hold of in Denmark. I think there are many plants who are producing this, but none yet producing only household waste as far as I am informed, but that can change rapidly. So, so you see this on this figure, you can just see how well these yellow and white dots, that's the household waste DACA and household waste Varga, how well that fits in with the on the green line, which shows when you have many rates of pig slurry, and then you of course see a decreasing output of the yield when you apply more and more nitrogen. But you can see that the household waste fits very well to the more detailed study with the pig slurry. And then what farmers are very concerned about when it comes to applying this digestate in field is the plastic residues. Could also be the heavy metals, but if you start on the bottom of this list on the right side, you can see that the cadmium content of the digestate is significantly lower in the household waste digestate than in pig slurry, which is a good thing. And then it's listed here all the regulations for how much other particles than organic material and nutrients and water the digestate may contain. And even if this pulp was really high quality and had much less plastic than it actually could have had and still comply with the regulation, with an application of 80 kilo ammonium nitrogen per hectare, it would cover close to 3 square meters per hectare, which doesn't seem very much, but still the farmers are concerned that they don't want to apply this. And so we have been doing more research on that in towards the end of Organic Plus, and there will be some interesting results also linking up with the plastic foil studies, which Francis will present. So then in Hohenheim, they had a very advanced study going over 2 years with a 2-year crop rotation with early cabbage, spinach, and winter wheat. And they were comparing all the types of fertilizers. So they applied different types of vegan fertilizers, clovergrass silage, and digested clovergrass with pig slurry, and also some legume pellets, and then digestates from household waste again, and then organic tofu whey. And as a control, they also had several controls, horn grit in different rates, and then composted farmyard manure, and a control with no fertilization. So you can look more in detail to these results yourself, because we are running a little bit out of time. But as you can see, if you just look at the head yields, you see that the horn grid, the highest level, performed best. But if you go to the standard level of horn grid, then the alternative fertilizers were not so far behind. And you can see that the yields were quite even if you take across all the treatments in the 2 testing years. And for the spinach, which was then coming after the cabbage and no extra fertilizer between the cabbage and the spinach, then we see that some of the fertilizers which didn't function so well for the cabbage, they had a higher residual effect, like the clover silage had a higher residual effect because the nitrogen was released a little bit slower. And then they also made a nutrient budget. And as you can see here, they focus especially on the clovergrass silage, that was maybe the best balanced fertilizer, because then you don't see large deficits. But with the horn grid, where you apply a lot of nitrogen and almost nothing else, then you have a high deficit, especially for this blue potassium. And if you apply the composted farmyard manure, you will get surplus of phosphorus. So in this you can go in more detail also if you like. We have to go to the next country, which was UK, where they tested the vegan fertilizers in a greenhouse with tomatoes. So they compared liquids from comfrey and nettle made on site, a lot of work, but and some smell, but the very locally produced fertilizer. Then they had a purchased fertilizer, a bean powder, which was actually intended for consumption, but also can be applied as fertilizer, and then the commercial control, which was based from molasses. And then they were weekly fertilization and weekly harvest. and 2 rates of these liquid fertilizers. And but as you can see here, the soil in this greenhouse was quite fertile. So if you look at the right side, the water control gave just as high yields as any of the fertilized treatments. And then they had 2 residual crops, Phacelia and Pak Choi, which also didn't give any yield differences. But as you can see here, they also measured a lot in the soil. So you can see what happens here after the final fertilization in October. The level of soil mineral nitrogen was not so high, but it increased to December and even more to March. And then you can see the efficiency of the Phacelia from March to May, that the Phacelia removed a lot of nitrogen. But you see that even in the and you also see that here in the water control is not so high in nitrogen as the fertilized treatments. So there were nitrogen in the fertilizers. Okay. So then we have one slide from Poland, because they did a very interesting trial to try to see if it was possible to have a sludge from organic fish ponds as a substrate in a compost. And they were actually able to, when they mixed this compost with the wheat straw and grass clippings, they were able to make a compost. The compost phase didn't last very long, so probably the compost wasn't very well matured when they mixed it into soil and used bean as a test crop. But still, if you look at the picture in the upper right corner, you can see that in the second row there, the bean plants after 12 weeks really have taken up some nutrients and have a positive growth as compared to the control treatment. So this is quite interesting. I think that you can do something with this substrate, which is really a problem for fish pond farmers to get rid of. And then also an interesting study from Turkey, where they this is also a type of resid material then, because it comes from organic olive production, and pruning material from taking off the branches of the olive trees in spring. That's often a problem, what to do with that material. But if you cut it and you mix it with some horse manure and grass clippings, and they also applied some beneficial microbes and treated this compost really well, as you can see here, giving water and everything. And then over only 8 months, they were able to make an excellent compost, which was performing very well as a growing media, like you can see here, for making olive saplings and also for producing cabbage and pepper. And there's a scientific paper about it. That was also the case for a Polish study, so you can read more. And then for the Norwegian trial, you can see here that we are working with the seaweed, a residual product from an industry making extracts from wild seaweed. We get the fiber, which they don't know what to do with. They're currently incinerating it. It's containing a lot of nutrients, so that's not so good. And then the fish bones, you can also see here, that's also a leftover product from the big fish industry in Norway. So that could very well be applied as a fertilizer. So you just see a little bit how we do the testing in field. And very, very rapidly, some results that the fish bones, they have a very rapid growth effect. Almost doubling the yields, like you can see here in the first season, but not so high effect in the next season. Whereas the seaweed fiber may have a little slightly negative effect in the first season. They have a very good after effect, like you can see here. That is the that is the yield of a second-year lay in 2021, which has not received any fertilizer since it was applied algae fiber or a mix of algae fiber and fish bones or this poultry manure, GO, or no fertilizer, KO, 0, in 2019. So it's a very high after effect, residual effect of the seaweed fiber, which is really interesting. Then we see a little bit the same here in potatoes, that also potatoes grown after application of these different fertilizers the previous year also respond positively to the algae fiber. But then it's a question, because the algae fiber contains quite a lot of arsenic, does that go into the potatoes? And the answer is it does not. So I just have to go quickly proceed here because we need to come to the conclusion. So the overall results and some system considerations. That the fertilization effect of our fertilizers, which we have been testing, they are comparable to contentious controls, like mostly the poultry manure or the horn grid. Amounts of such fertilizers available in society may be significant, but there is something about infrastructure and regulations which have to be adapted, and the cost for fertilization for the farmers may very well have to rise. So about the urban fertilizers, digestate, maybe some compost, that's very, if we talk about digestate, it's nice to apply for cereals, but what about other crops? Then we need to change the regulations. And then about the plastic residues, how serious should we take that? And now, are the farmers right to worry? And then I put up two pictures from the right side, which I found quite interesting. Yesterday in the Norwegian news was these pictures about a small insect building its nest of small plastic particles, which is would normally do by small stones or small pieces of wood. But now it has much more easy access to plastic. So it has started to build its nest out of plastic. That is in a small pond on the Norwegian coast. And then below is the famous picture of this whale stranding, or which was dying because it had eaten a lot of plastic bags a few years ago, also on the Norwegian coast. So if you imagine that this could maybe happen with some soil animals eating all these plastic residues, so maybe it can very well be quite serious also on a much smaller scale with soil fauna. We should check this much better. Okay, so what about the vegan fertilizers? Well, as I mentioned, they are cheap but labor intensive. And on the other side, the purchased products are very expensive. And then it's the internal recycling challenges, because you need phosphorus and potassium to get them produce nitrogen efficiently if you want to rely on legumes. And the fine-tuning for nitrogen mineralization may be quite challenging, as we saw in this UK trial with the tomatoes. And with the resid fertilizers like fish bones or olive branches, that can of course be applied for fertilization, but it could also become competition for materials with other sectors of the circular economy. Several materials have a high potential. We need to be aware of the toxic compounds. Everything we use in industry ends up in the sea. So there is also something about organic pollutants in marine materials. And again, this fine-tuning for nitrogen mineralization might be challenging. And then I come up with a final slide that I think we need to combine a little bit more like top-down approach on the relax, because you are working on national level in many things you presented, Jakob, which is very interesting. And we have been maybe more working with a little bit more like bottom up, or more with going into action with some relevant fertilizers. And you demonstrated that many organically managed farms need inputs of phosphorus and potassium, whereas some farms should find nitrogen fertilizers with less P. And we have demonstrated that many materials may be applied for fertilization, and with less animals, we need to recycle more nutrients from fork to field. I think we completely agree on that. And this will create new linkages between consumers and farmers. And organic agriculture needs adapted regulations to support such recycling, while we also maintain a high food quality. And so we have a lot to discuss, and that we could possibly do at field days with farmers and other events like we are doing now. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Anne-Kristin, for bringing the results of Organic Plus, and also for bringing this clearly these three strategies of urban residues and vegan waste sources or nutrient sources. I will not ask you a follow-up question because we are a bit running out of time, so I will immediately go to the next speaker, and that is Francis Rayns from Coventry University, also a researcher at the Organic Plus project, and he will speak about research into use of peat and plastics. So, Francis, if you can.
Hello, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you, and if you can put a full screen.
Yeah, it should be. Oh. Yeah, there we are. Can you see that? Perfect. All right?
Yes.
All right then. My name's Francis Rayns from Coventry University, as has just been said, and in my talk, I'm going to talk about the two other aspects of the of this soil task within Organic Plus. So first of all, peat, and then I'll come on to talk about plastic shortly. First of all, considering peat, and there's within the project, there's been a lot of organisations been involved in this, and within each organisation, even more staff members. So I'm not going to list all their names, but I do acknowledge their contribution to the work that's been done. The task on peat has been led by Rafi Canceras at ERTA in Catalonia in Spain. So she's been managing it, but I'll be giving this presentation today. Although organic crops obviously have got to be predominantly grown in the ground, that's sort of in the regulations, they've got to be the actual main production phase has got to be soil based. Of course, many crops, particularly vegetable crops, spend a period of their time in some sort of containerized growing medium. Particularly vegetable transplant crops and also some tree crops. You can see there a picture on the right hand side of a tomato, sort of some tomatoes that are actually used in the trials that Anne-Kristin mentioned, and of course they were raised in containerized growing media. And the question is what to make this media out of. As throughout the 20th century, peat became a widely used in growing media because it's uniform, it's lightweight to transport, it's very stable, it stores well, and it's very low in nutrients. So it can be very predictably amended with fertilizers. So in many respects, peat is the perfect growing medium to use. But of course, the downside of it is that there are these vital ecosystem services that peatlands provide. It's a sort of unique environment. Lots of animals require this kind of wild conditions to grow in. So habitats and biodiversity has been recognized as very important. More recently, there's been a lot of attention paid to the role that kind of upland peat systems can provide as regards to water management and mitigation of flood risk, and that's become an issue perhaps in times of climate change. And also these undrained peat bogs really do store huge amounts of carbon, and so that's obviously important as a way of mitigating or preventing climate change getting worse. So for these reasons, the desirability of using peat as a growing media has really kind of fallen out of favor. And this isn't a new thing. It was certainly in the UK anyway, kind of people have been campaigning against the use of peat for 40 years or more. But recently it's become more to the fore, and there are just some examples here on this slide of various issues or various articles in the popular press, in newspapers and so forth, suggesting particularly that domestic gardeners minimize the use of peat. And one thing that we felt when we were sort of planning the Organic Plus project, that it was very important that organic production systems are not left behind in these developments, because there's a danger that well, not danger as such, but it's certainly possible that governments might actually prohibit the use of peat for growers in general, and sort of the organic people will be left, they should really be at the forefront of campaigning for environmental sustainability, not lagging behind. So here are just some examples of some of the experimental work that we've been doing. As I say, this whole concept isn't a new thing by any means. People have been looking at alternatives of a whole variety of products that can be used. One of the main things that's quite popular, at least in the UK and I think other European countries, is coir, that's based on coconut production and relies on import from particularly from Sri Lanka and other tropical countries. But we tried to focus in our work on materials that could be sourced either on farm or certainly near to hand, and ideally kind of making use of some waste materials that are kind of problems to deal with in the local to wherever the plants are grown, wherever they're local to wherever they're needed. And we focus particularly on two types of materials: extruded materials and composted materials. The extrusion is kind of an interesting way of dealing with materials to kind of render organic matter, and particularly woody organic matter, down into this sort of kind of fluffy individual fibers that you can see in the picture at the bottom left there. This is kind of what they come out typically like, and there's a whole range of different materials that can be put through this process, usually which involves a kind of a sort of compression and twisting and turning, often done with a machine called the twin screw extruder. But there are other techniques that can be used, but basically the kind of mechanical process often heats the materials up and kind of tears the fibers apart to make them into a material that can be included in growing media. And we've looked at a range of things, either the shredded prunings from either olives or grapes, wood chips of various fibers, various species, and there's a paper being published which kind of describes the mechanical properties of these after they've been extruded, and discusses the suitability for their for inclusion in growing media. So that's extruded materials. We've also done a lot of work between us on various sorts of composted materials. Again, using some of the same starting things as the olive prunings, also looking at wood chips of different sorts, horse manure, leafy residues. All of these can be composted alone or in combination. We've done at Coventry, we've done a lot of work with this grower who you can see in the photo at the top right hand side. This is somebody called Ian Tolhurst, and he's really pioneered in a very non-academic way the use of wood chip compost for use in growing media. Some people are surprised that you can compost wood chips, thinking that it will have far too much carbon to the nitrogen, but he has found that with the addition of small amounts of green waste from kind of vegetable surplus vegetables, kind of crop residues, and a small amount of soil, he's been able to produce a very effective growing media and been using this for some years. And so we've been doing some tests with his materials and also making some of our own. Interesting. One of the problems with the extruded materials is that they can be quite low in nutrients, and one of the problems with the composted materials is that the nutrients can be actually excessive and in kind of unreliable amounts. So they're kind of contrasting problems there, and we've been doing some work between us to look at how different blends and mixtures of raw materials and actually processed materials can be blended to produce an effective growing media. One of the key things that we think is important with regard to the peat alternatives is that we don't want to replace peat with something which might be just as bad for the environment in a different way. And so we've been working with in support of this UK initiative to develop a scheme for assessing the credentials of growing media which consider a whole range of aspects, not just the looking at the energy use, the water use, how socially compliant they are, how well treated the people are who produce the materials, what the effects are on the habitat and biodiversity from whence they come, what effects there are on pollution with heavy metals or whatever it is, how renewable these materials are, and how intensive the use of resources is to produce these materials. And this scheme has been developed as sort of through both a government and also linked with the growing media industry in the UK to develop what's known as this sort of matrix for responsible sourcing, and that's going to be wheeled out next year to the to kind of amateur and professional sales of growing media in the UK. And at the moment it's kind of aimed at commercial producers, but we've been looking to see how this could be used by individual farmers who might source their own materials, either composted or extruded or from some other source, to kind of as a kind of all-in assessment tool for growing media. And in many respects, this type of work, this responsible sourcing, really could be used as a bit of a pioneer approach to be that could be used for other inputs, contentious or otherwise, within the organic certified production systems. So just to summarize that, many types of material are available for utilization in growing media. Sometimes they can be sourced quite cheaply on farm, but there's lots of costs in time in terms of that. More knowledge is required to be able to use them effectively, and organic agriculture should really be leading the way in terms of the use of phasing out peat and ensuring that alternatives are responsibly sourced. So that briefly is what we've been doing on peat. I'm just going to go on briefly to talk about some of our the other work within the soil work package, which is to look or to minimize the use of fossil fuel derived plastic in agriculture, and particularly in horticulture. Again, there's been several institutions you can see listed on the left, and this work was led, or the task was led, by Krystyna Malinska from Poland. There are obviously many plastics used, and it's a huge subject. So within the Organic Plus project, we decided to concentrate on alternatives to plastic mulches used for weed control, as this practice is really kind of the most contentious, because there you've got the plastic in really intimate contact with the soil. It's laid directly on the soil, and so any degradation of the plastic, it goes, there's very little scope for clearing it up. So it's a very contentious area to use. Of course, synthetic mulches, you can see an illustration in the picture here. They can be used for weed control and are very useful for reducing hand labor, very good for reducing herbicides, and indeed can be used in conventional systems. But they are an expensive industrial product brought in from far away, usually products of the petrochemical industry, and very difficult to recycle, although in theory they can be gathered up and sent for recycling. Most recycling factories, they don't really want them because they're too contaminated with soil, plant remains, they're kind of very messy, and so a lot of them either end up getting landfilled, or in some cases just burnt in fields, which is obviously a very bad thing. There are biodegradable film mulches which are commercially available, but more work we felt was needed to evaluate their effectiveness and indeed their production from a wider range of raw materials. Within the Organic Plus project in Poland, our partners worked with a local industrial partner to develop novel materials. You can see the stages of the production from the raw material, often some sort of starch. In this case, they use potato starch. These are kind of melted and made into the film mulches, which can be multi-layered, incorporating fillers that could reduce the cost, because one of the issues with using biodegradable mulches is that they are significantly more expensive than kind of single-use polythene mulches, and so keeping the cost down is an important consideration. And indeed, there's scope for perhaps including other materials, perhaps liming agents or other possibly plant control agents could be included in the within the mulch itself. So that could be an interesting idea for the future. We did field trials in both the UK and also in Turkey, using a whole range of the novel materials, the commercially available biodegradable mulches and non-biodegradable mulch controls, also weeded and unweeded controls. You can just see some pictures here. We used onions, cabbages and peppers as test crops. There isn't time to kind of go into all the ins and outs of the details, but one thing that we did confirm was that some of the translucent mulches were ineffective in certain crops, because the weeds just grew underneath them and they tore too easily. There's a slight mistake there on the slide. I've just noticed because they were effective in the cabbages, but not in the onions, because the cabbages, although they degraded in both circumstances, in the cabbage crops they lasted for long enough to suppress the weeds effectively, whereas the onions, being less competitive, they broke down too soon. So that just shows that different materials might be, sort of more suitable or less suitable for particular cases. It's quite interesting as well on these white mulches without dyes in them. You were able to see the fungi beginning to take hold, and obviously that's something that you wouldn't have been able to see on if they'd had a black dye and making them more weed suppressive. So that's more of a sort of incidental observation there. Again, just a quick slide here. You'll perhaps have time if you look at the to look in more detail later on. You can study this graph in greater detail. It was also subject of a paper published at the Organic World Congress. Basically, the mulches which were more effective at suppressing weeds had much better yields of crops. One thing we're working on at present, because this is kind of very agronomic. We looked at the performance of the mulches in the field. How quickly did they break down visibly? How well did they suppress the yields? How well did they suppress the weeds? What effect did they have on the crops? But of course, even the biodegradable ones might have detrimental effects on the soil. So we've got samples that we've got a bit of a backlog of, partly because of COVID, that we were unable to get into the laboratories. But we're testing these samples of soils, looking for microplastic residues and also for plasticizer residues that might have come out of the various different materials and contaminated the soil. And this kind of comes back to the thing that I was saying about the peat alternatives. We want to be a bit careful that we're not replacing a contentious input with something that might well be worse. And that also feeds into the work that I think we're going to talk about more tomorrow, with the kind of the life cycle assessments of some of these inputs. So it's important to kind of keep in mind the bigger picture when looking at these individual trials. On the subject of using kind of mulches that are based on farm rather than the sort of these industrialized products from far away, we've also been doing some trials to look at loose mulches which could be used for weed suppression, which might be in many respects an ideal alternative to the kind of the commercialized film mulches. We've looked at a kind of an array of products here. We've looked at wood chips, and some of these materials are actually the same as have been used in the growing media trials. So there is a kind of an overlap there. That we've looked at wood chip, either made from poplar or willow. We've looked at an extruded material, the extruded poplar that was extruded in Germany with our partners over there, that could be used as a sort of laid on the surface as a mulch. So that's made from the same material as the poplar chips. We also looked at green waste compost, grass clippings and hay. And you can see in the picture on the right, these were laid out in a replicated trial, with different rates of application. We've also grown an onion crop through them. And it's really kind of given some interesting results. Some of them were much more effective than others. We found that to be effective, and this is quite a weedy field, so we realized that we were actually testing them in sort of quite severe conditions. They had to be applied at quite high levels to be effective. And that obviously can have an implication on the nutrient dynamics of the farming system. And we've also taken soil samples to look at the effects, particularly on the nitrogen patterns of nitrogen dynamics, because some of these materials are likely to add nutrients to the field, particularly the grass clippings, kind of a sort of source of fresh organic matter, could be readily drawn into the soil by worms and so forth, might be expected to add nitrogen, add available nitrogen, whereas some of the woody materials are more likely to lock it up as a result of the kind of high carbon that they contain. The other thing is that some of them are kind of virtually sterile, virtually inert, and we found an interesting effect with the hay. In the first year, this was the most effective material that we tried, very good at suppressing the weeds. This year, when we tried it, it came from a different batch of hay, which contained quite a lot of weed seeds of plantains. And so we effectively sowed a crop of weeds in those plots. So that wasn't so successful this year. And that just sort of shows the importance of generalizing these recommendations. So just to kind of summarize the weed control or the mulch work that we've been doing, the black mulches that we tested were all very effective, the biodegradable ones, the non-biodegradable ones, the novel ones, the commercial ones. So they were all very effective at suppressing the weeds, at least while the crops are growing. The white mulches that broke down before the end of the season could be worthwhile in some crops. But after the crop was harvested, all the mulches kind of degraded quite rapidly. The polythene mulches disintegrated. The woven polypropylene which is designed to be used for several years, that did remain intact. But even the biodegradable ones, when the parts on the surface, they persisted for quite some months, and even when incorporated, they don't break down as quickly as some people perhaps expect them to do. And that's why we're really looking at the kind of the longer term effects of adding these things to the soil. The loose mulches can offer an on-farm alternative to industrialized films, but they do need to be applied at a high rate to be effective, and this can have an effect on the nutrient dynamics and possibly on the ability to actually source these materials in sufficient quantities where they're actually needed. And I think if that was scaled up to a kind of whole field scale, that could be a problem for some farmers, although for others it maybe once having an agroforestry system, that could be ideal. Just briefly to say at the end, I said we would focus on mulches. That in Poland, they have done work to produce a range of kind of horticultural appliances or horticultural sundries using biodegradable plastics. On the left, you can just see a picture there of some little clips that can be used for training
Francis, in the interest of time, could you please wrap up so that we have some time left for discussion?
Yeah, I'm nearly there. Yeah, so so it could be, and these incorporate biochar as a filler, whereas on the right-hand side you can see a material again including extruded wood fiber and these degradable plastics that could be used for pots or other materials. there's a paper published on that. And yeah, that's just the end of my presentation. So yeah, so over to you if you've got any questions. Sorry, it overran a little bit.
Okay, thanks a lot for bringing your insights on the use of peat and plastic mulches and their alternatives. I will follow up with a question immediately for you, and in the meantime, ask the audience to keep posting their questions in the chat. The question is about the peat alternatives. You showed this sustainable or responsible sourcing matrix, and I was surprised to see that green compost has quite a low social compliance. Why is that?
I don't know the actual details of it. I must say, and this was just a kind of an example, because the idea is that the individual producers will you know, it's not just like a one size fits all. The idea is that individual producers and individual streams of materials would do their own calculations to work out what is, you know, what the situation is for their particular batch. So I don't know if Margie Lennartson, who's had more to do with this side of things, I don't know, I think she's in the audience, maybe she can
okay, then she can type
she can type something. Yes, maybe she has got a better answer than that. But yeah, this was just an example of the things. It wasn't like, you know, this is the, you know, Peat scores 22 and something else scores 5. It's more complicated than that.
Okay, good. Then I have a question for Jakob and Anne-Kristin. Both your presentations showed that depending on the region and the farming system, other types and on other sources of nutrients can be exploited. So could you elaborate on that? Which parts of Europe are more likely to use which types of nutrients? Is there, like, yeah, can you give some indications there?
Maybe Jakob first.
Well, I mean, I think we need quite a bit more data on this. I mean, as you could see from the slides I showed, that there's a great disparity between, for example, the Hungarian situation where they source nutrients from hundreds of kilometers away, and Denmark where it's more like the neighboring farm or municipality and so on. So there's a great difference, and we have or are in the process of developing a tool that you can use for plotting in number of farms, number of animals in the regions, and other sources of nutrients. I mean, organic farms with animals, and then you can look at the possibility, make a regional analysis, and say, well, what can you actually source in this region? Now it's been applied to the case of Switzerland by Elsa Bühnemann. I'm not quite sure if she's ready to show this. We will also apply it to, for example, Estonia and so on. But I'm sure that even after having made this exercise, we will still be in need of more data. That is as far as I can say. But I think that also Anne-Kristin's presentation shows that if you're innovative, you can really find many interesting local alternatives. So I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do here.
I think that fertilizers will remain bulky products, which the farmer, of course, will try to get hold of as cheap as possible. And unless we want to pay much more for food, we also need to arrange this so that the fertilizers can't be too expensive. so that also means we need to find locally available materials and then things like biogas plants and how to compost the substrates in such plants and so on. That is also dependent on the local conditions quite a lot. If you have a gas grid like you have in Denmark, for instance, which we don't have in Norway, things like that affect a lot also on the situation for the availability of fertilizers. But I think in general, if you would try to work more to make people convinced that also application of nutrients from the sewage stream is a good idea, and then struvite becomes permitted for use during 2022. I think that that opens some very interesting perspectives, and that is something which can be a quite similar product across Europe, I think. So that is something we maybe could discuss a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. There's actually a question from Jan de Koeier, who asked, what is your opinion on struvite for the organic sector? What are upsides and downsides? So we know that ECTOP has approved struvite as a product permitted according to the organic regulation. It can be used in organic agriculture. We're waiting still for the next steps in the approval procedure, but soon it will be allowed. So yeah, what is your opinion about this product?
Well, I have the impression, I mean, first of all, it's a good fertilizer. I mean, it's more or less on par with triple superphosphate. But I think that, I mean, being allowed in organic farming, it's a good pea fertilizer. Secondly, I mean, I noted that at least the Danish farmers in their talk about fertilizers, they said that we really need fertilizers that contain more than just phosphorus. So, I mean, it may not be the solution to all problems. So I mean, it's a question of where is the need for singular pea fertilizers. And then finally, there's a question of the availability. I mean, it's I heard, but I don't know, but I heard from the Danish water companies that their interest in struvite is waning. I mean, it's not really practical for them to invest a lot in it and so on. But I'm not very knowledgeable about actual availability of struvite.
Well, I think the good thing about this is it is that you are able to precipitate a lot of the nutrients, also the nitrogen, from the sewage without adding anything, just by stimulating the microbial processes in this process. And and also it seems in comparison to things like stripping off ammonia from sewage, it seems to be also a quite low-tech technology in many ways. So I think it's quite promising. And when you see the declining trend in long-term soil analysis on organically managed farms that you presented, Jakob, which we can also confirm from Norway, I think it's that's really, we need to do something to counteract such a development, to keep the soil fertile. I mean, but of course, the question, it is a mineral nitrogen, and that we haven't been discussed a lot. And I heard that in Denmark we're testing it as a start fertilizer for sugar beet. That was maybe not the intention of using struvite in the field. So yeah.
Okay, and what about the direct use of sewage sludge? If I understood well, Jakob, you've also investigated this, and you saw actually that there is not so much risks associated with it, but farmers are very critical or averse because of potential contamination. What is your opinion about the use of sewage sludge?
It is a discussion. It has been a discussion in Denmark because, I mean, really, honestly, I mean, if you look at where can you source phosphorus, for example, that will be needed. I mean, there's just not enough of it in, for example, household waste or so on. So I mean, it's pretty critical to get that stream into organic farming, and then the question is, do you want it to be in a highly chemically transformed form? I mean, where you go over the ash and then you somehow purify the ash, or what do you want to do? The thing is that, I mean, our perception of sewage sludge has been to a great extent formed by the qualities that were available during and after the Second World War, where the industry was in a different state. We have changed our regulation, environmental ruling, and also we've outsourced quite a lot of production from Europe to Asia and so on. So, I mean, the whole waste stream is a different world today, and I guess that the question is, can we reconcile recycling in the waste stream we have today with organic farming? And I can also tell you that we are now, for the time being, in Denmark, we are trying to make surveys of consumer acceptance of this, and at least the qualitative interviews show that that the committed organic consumers will accept this once they realize that we already use pig slurry, conventional pig slurry, and I mean, we could maybe replace that or partly replace it. I mean, so it's a discussion. It's not, I mean, obviously it's not possible to do it today, but maybe in the future.
But do you think that vegan consumers will accept this?
I haven't looked into that, but I think the argument came, maybe it was Ulrich who wrote that they should do that, and of course, I mean, they have to accept human fertilizers, or else it would be gaga. But I don't know if they will.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, let's stand still a bit with discussion of vegan agriculture in the framework of nutrients. Do you think vegan agriculture is a possibility? Can we do we no longer need animal production, or you still think some animal production will be needed to provide sufficient nutrients?
Coming from a country where we can almost only grow grass, and we have such a lot of remote fields which should be utilized for grazing, I'm not very much in favor of veganism. So to be honest, I think that I'm a little bit biased to discuss, but of course, it could be possible to design a system with vegan production where you really rely a lot on recycling human nutrients back to the soil, because yeah.
Okay, that's clear. Francis, you want to come in?
I was just going to say, I think I suppose one of the arguments, it might be more of an economic argument, because yeah, it's how you can utilize, you could grow all your own nutrients maybe, but if it comes at the expense of not being able to get a direct financial return in the meantime, that's something, that could be a problem. If you can't graze, as Anne-Kristin said, if you can't, you can't graze the land or whatever.
Okay, good. Then there are some more specific questions about some of the nutrient sources that were presented. And Christine, Lizzie asks about the salt content of the seaweed, and if this poses a problem, it could be a reason of the lower yield that you observed. So one of the nutrient sources you presented was seaweed, and is there a problem with salt content?
Yeah, if you are going to apply fresh seaweed, you should make sure to clean it if it comes directly from the ocean. But if you just put it on the shore for a short while, normally it takes a few weeks with some rain, then it's enough. But this seaweed material was a residue from an industrial process. So this is not the question. I don't think that gives the explanation here, but it's maybe more that the pH was very high, and we don't know really why it takes such quite long time to get it active in the soil. But then very interesting to see this very long-term residual effect. But we applied quite high amounts of material. That also has to be said, because it doesn't contain a lot of nitrogen, and we wanted to so we needed to apply a lot of material to get this high enough rate of nitrogen, which we aimed for.
Mm-hmm. Then one more question for Francis. How can you compare the environmental impact of plastic mulch compared to mechanical weeding? Because mechanical weeding also is often energy intensive. And uses hence fossil fuels. So what would you prefer then, if that's possible to make a ranking? Is better mechanical weeding or plastic mulch?
I think it's very difficult. It's a bit like kind of comparing apples and oranges. I mean, obviously, in a very sort of reductionist carbon footprinting kind of way, it could be done to look at the look at the amount of diesel for the tractor versus the the amount of energy that's gone into growing the crops to produce the mulch. I think it's probably that there's different techniques that will be suitable in different circumstances, because I mean, mechanical weeding as a whole, there's all sorts of different approaches there. I mean, I think ideally, and it's easier said than done, of course, you'd have like better long-term weed management, having longer rotations with kind of more time dedicated to fertility building crops that would kind of minimize the amount of weeds in vegetable systems in the first place, and kind of be more rigorous about having stale seed beds and things like that to reduce the amount of weeds. I think it's got to be, it's not one thing or another. It's all got to be part of a package. And I'm sure there is a place for the biodegradable mulches, but perhaps not just to, not just to rely on them absolutely as the kind of the way that weeds are controlled on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And obviously they're also only suitable for some crops. It wouldn't work very well with carrots, which are perhaps one of the weediest vegetable crops. So yeah.
Okay, good. I think that's a very good concluding remark. It's actually very similar to the plant protection products. There is no one solution that is better than the other. It's always a package, and ecological management, sound ecological management comes always first before considering inputs. So this applies also to the nutrients and to the mulching. Then we go to a lunch break now. The speakers of this session will be available in the lounge until around 1 o'clock to answer any other questions that you might have. So if you would like to speak individually with the speakers, then I invite you to go to the lounge, and else you can go to the lunch, and we see each other again at 2 o'clock, where we will continue with the sessions on animal production. So we will go deeper into antibiotics, anthelmintics, and vitamins, as well as novel building materials. So I wish you all a very good break, and I hope to see you back at 2 o'clock.